So, who was at this pre-party yesterday? One person, two, because I was there and I was alone. And it's not funny. I came there and I was expecting like 500 people to welcome me, like, hey Nick, how is it? And there were 500 people, but they didn't know me. So what happened? I mean, okay, because I know you guys can't actually party, because I was at a Ruby shift in Dnipropetrovsk. Can you hear how I can say the name of the city? Actually, when this picture was taken, I was sleeping somewhere in the background, curing from a very bad hangover. And not only the conference was great, also the after party. And the last thing I can remember is a big bottle. And I'm not talking about bottle, I'm talking about this bottle. And then you check the size of this bottle, and now check the size of my head. And I had this bottle. Of course, I drank it all by myself. And so theoretically, I had, like, it was some hookah or something. And we drank it with a strange ceremony, like burning, and then you had a straw in the glass. And then you drank it once, I can't remember it, because theoretically I had my head filled twice with this sambuca. So what happened was, this is me after 15 minutes, and this is me after 17 minutes. You can see my camera is drunk as well, so so I had a really good time there. And you guys are going to be around tonight, because I want to have another great party! So, let's get back to the topic. What we were talking about, I think the rails, right? So I want you guys to take a long look at this picture. Oops. Just kidding. Oh. So, do you see the symbol, the metaphor, like the train and rails and tracks and stuff? It's cool, right? So this is a train, and its reason for being here is to transport people from point A to point B. And I think this train might do a great job. So I think there will be like 700,000 people on this train getting from point A to point B. So the purpose is served for this train. On the first sight, but if you look twice, there might be a couple of issues with this overloaded train. Namely, so one benefit is the air conditioning might be quite good for the people. One of the drawbacks is it might be very slow because it's overloaded. If there is a problem in the train, then what are you laughing at? Do you know one of those guys? So if there is a problem and the train has to stop, it might take 17 hours to find the problem, because there are millions of people surrounding the train and the mechanics can't get to the problem. Also, I think the driver of the train has a big problem because he can't see the way. And the last thing is, if there is a cow on the track, this guy is going to break his leg, and that is not nice. So, what do we learn? Don't overload your train. And here's an example how we overload our trains and rails. So this is the first code slide. Yes. Are you ready? Yeah. Are you ready? Yeah. So this is really the first slide. Yeah, it is. I'm missing the actual. So there should be a slide having an active record base user class. I don't know where the slide is, but I might have lost it on the way to Ukraine. And in this class there is an after create hook, and this after create hook, or it's an after save hook. This after save hook sends out notifications to people because the user model was changed. So if I use this in my controller and I create a user and then I call save, it's awesome because the after save hook will send out a notification, and the user will going to be informed about that he was created or whatever. Now if I use the same API in a migration, because I'm like doing a migration and I think I'm smart and I change the user model and then I call save. What happens? Of course, the notification is sent again. And if I have a migration looping over, let's say, 200,000 user objects, I send out 200,000 SMS, which is shitty, because it might cost you a little bit. Ah, there we go, that's the class I was talking about. It just moved. And the problem here is to make it short that we are overloading our classes in Rails. And the problem here is in Rails there is a kind of tunnel vision right now. We're moving to the end of the tunnel, so there is light, but we still have some people telling us best practices, and a lot of things in Rails are awesome. But some of those best practices, like overloading your classes, is simply wrong. So it's shit. And you end up with huge controllers, even bigger models, and unmanageable fat views. Google image search, if you type in fat view, you get this picture. And I'm not giving this talk because I want to bash Rails and tell people like, hey, this is shit, you gotta be more object-oriented because object orientation is the shit. I'm talking about that kind of stuff and solutions because a lot of people keep complaining about their Rails applications, about classes getting too big, like, hey, help me, my model is about 700 lines of code, what can I do? So this talk is meant to help people, because I like to help people and to change the world into a better place. Thank you, you guys are awesome. The biggest problem I see in Rails is fat model, skinny controller, paradigm, pattern, whatever. Who came up with that crap? Because I'd love to put it in my campfire. This talk is about campfires, by the way. And so a lot of people agree with me. I think all of you agree with me that fat model, skinny controller, two big classes are a big mistake, right? But we still have a problem in the Rails community. So let's say this train is my user class I just showed you, and all of these people are features like notification, saving, validation, whatever. Then what do you think about this approach? So in this example, in this picture, we have the same amount of people. Everyone gets from point A to point B by himself. We don't have any dependencies because every bike can go somewhere which direction it wants, can take shortcuts. And we have less steel. And we still get from point A to point B. So this should demonstrate the principle of decoupling. So if you have a big problem, if you have a complex complex problem to solve in your software, cut it into pieces. That is a beautiful picture with red, I know. And try to divide your complexity into smaller parts to manage the complexity in a smaller piece. We don't do that in Rails because I invented the sickness of fear of that class. That sounds awesome, right? Okay. Do you know this guy? And the fear of the class in Rails is basically people being afraid of introducing new classes, solving problems in separate classes, in separate instances. We still work on controllers, on models like active record base instances, and in views, instead of having millions of classes. We don't need millions of classes, that would be over-engineering. But we don't have to be afraid of getting Java-like. I love this comparison because using instances is not or using classes and instances is not a sickness, it is a way to solve problems. Can I have some water? Ah! Sorry.
Spoilers.
Ah, I didn't open my bottle, so I have to open it now. By the way, I bought this new presenter after I think 20 talks. It's not only 70 euros, It also has a timer which vibrates 5 minutes before my talk should be finished. So if I suddenly jump around, it's my timer. And guys, now look. Wow. It's not red, it's green. $70, Logitech. Okay, so let's check some of the. I told you to cut down problems into pieces. Let's see how we can do that in the model layer, then in the view layer, and then in the controller. And my first example is how to split domain and persistence. And we had a great talk by Piotr Sonika this morning. So I'll talk shortly, very briefly about that kind of stuff because he already gave a great introduction to data mapper. So if I want to split my domain, my actual business logic from my persistence, what is a domain? My domain in this example is a campfire, two cowboys chatting with each other, right? So I have Jim, that's the one cowboy on the left. He's asking, hey Steve, you want some drink? And Steve is replying, oh yes. So that is all I want to solve in my Rails problem, and my Rails program. And I'm going to use poros, not pornos, poros. Plain old Ruby objects. So what I want to model is, I instantiate two cowboys, give them names, and then I let Jim say, want some drink, Steve? Which returns a question object, because it's a question. And Steve can respond by using the respond method. And he can respond by, well now let me use my laser pointer. He can respond by using respond and then passing in the question. That actually doesn't really matter for our problem here. So I use OpenStruct. I derive cowboy from OpenStruct. Do you guys know OpenStruct? Yeah. It's awesome. So I just pass in arbitrary values in the constructor, and OpenStruct will give me automatic accessors for the stuff I passed in the constructor. So to say the initial phrase, I use my cowboy, and then I implement a say method, receiving the message, the what, the content, and then I instantiate a message object, which gets the content, the message I want to say, and then I push that message object on a chat stack, nothing more. So I don't think about tables and active record base. I know you guys are already like, okay, we can have a messages table and a chats table and a response table and stuff. So I'm working with plain objects. And to model the response, like Steve.respond, I introduce a new method called respond, which receives the message and the question. Then I instantiate a response object, pass in the message, and the question is responding to, and then I push that thing on the chat stack. The message object is another OpenStruct, and the response we are using is derived from message, so it's going to be an OpenStruct as well. And to run that, we are using tests. Of course we do. Who's not doing tests? Who's not programming? Okay. You're a liar. So, I just created a chat array. I told you it's a stack, nothing more. Then I do instantiate Jim and Steve, the cowboys, pass in the chat object as well. And then I call say on Jim, and I call respond on Steve, so to model my chat. And basically, if I call chat.toReadable, it should be something like two cowboys were sitting at a campfire. Jim said, want to drink, Steve? Where Steve, who was already loaded as shit, responded, oh yes. And both were happy to the end of the days. And if I run this test, it's going to be 5 nanoseconds. So it's not going to take 2 minutes to run all the Rails stuff. It's going to take, this is a fake value, of course. It's like half a second. So we could, what I did is I modeled my whole problem in plain Ruby. And I didn't give any bothering, any shit about the persistence. So that is nice, and it works pretty well, but in real applications, that's what Piotr also said, we need persistence, of course. And there are several... Take a picture. too slow. So we need persistence, and there's several approaches. So one of them is data mapper. That's what Piotr introduced this morning. So basically, you push modules into your poros, into your business objects to make them persistent. So you can configure your poros, you can configure the database fields, and data mapper will automatically back your plain old Ruby object with the database table and synchronize and stuff. So I came up with an idea. I'm going to show you. It's basically the same as data mapper 2. So I have my plain old Ruby object. Then I have an arbitrary database table object. Like here it's a message, persistence message derived from active record base. Then I have some strange configuration class which connects the message, the plain old Ruby object, with my active record. And then I can ask the repository, hey, give me a message with ID 1. And what I get back is a plain old Ruby object, but it is kind of wrapped. So if I call message.content, content will come from the database table. So this is like this roughly the same as data mapper 2. So what we do is we wrap the plain old Ruby object, the stuff we want to work with, and some arbitrary database backend object in a composition. And that is pretty sweet. People love that. I told you, we were having a great party, and why is my battery flashing? I tell you, if you're gonna die now, I'll kill you. So, friendly people, happiness, that is the Ruby community. Let's get, so this was a little bit about the model layer, and we already had that great talk. I can't repeat it again from Piotr. Let's see what we can do in the view. But by the way, I'm very bad at view, so I can't do JavaScript and stuff. I just love view architecture. So let's say, you remember that chat we had, and the chat I modeled with Ruby and stuff. Let's say one of the requirements to our application is having a sidebar. And the sidebar has a top. Let me use my laser pointer again. Oh, by the way, I had a great feature in this talk. I can't do it today because we're missing the audio cable. Every time I said Rails, this song was played. Oh, you can't hear it. I will show you later because I missed this feature because I passed out a remote control, and every time I said Rails, somebody had to push the button and then the sound was played. It was a lot of fun, but not today. Back to the sidebar. In the top we have like a box displaying recent messages from the chat. Yeah, okay, so let's say this would be want some drink, Steve? Oh yes. So that is just a small feature. And in the lower box, in the sidebar, this would display the participation in the chat. So with some algorithm we would figure out, okay, Jim is talking way less than Steve. It's just a bullshit feature, but it serves the purpose to show you view architecture. To achieve that kind of stuff, you usually use a partial, and then you, let's say I call them partial sidebar, so you render a partial sidebar, and the sidebar partial would render the recent messages, and then you would just iterate through chat.messages or whatever. And then you would call maybe a helper for the second box to render the pie chart, so nothing special. And now your boss comes and tells you, hey, this is nice, but let's have another sidebar, or let's tweak or configure the sidebar. So in the lower part, I want to have a happiness indicator, which analyzes the chats and looks for words like beer and Ukraine and drunk, and it computes a magic happiness value. So what we get basically is a configurable sidebar. And another problem is I want to have the graph. Whose phone is this? You're getting a call. So I want to have the chart in the lower box on, let's say, 3 different controllers, and I want to have the happiness box on another controller. So you're getting a problem of reusable components in your Rails application. And if you look at our partial, that sucks. So I'll use a view component, a gem called cells. I talked about it last year, and I was so happy to have a big audience because it's my gem. And I'll show you how to use a view component to build a reusable, reusable component for your view. So we have the chats controller. It just finds the chat object and stuff. And then in the chat controller view, we no longer call render partial. We call render cell. And what I do here is I advise render cell to call the sidebar cell and render the show action. And I pass in the chat object. So it's a little bit like a partial. Let's check the cell. So the cell is basically like a controller, but it's completely isolated from the rest of the application. So what I do here is I create an instance of sidebar cell, and then I call the show action and pass in, and I get in the chat object as a message argument, as a method argument, sorry. And when I call render, the sidebar cell will call app cells sidebar show. And I just copied the partial from the Rails application into that cell view for now. Okay? So it's basically like a controller, but a completely isolated rendering cycle. It has nothing to do with the rest of your application stack. And if I look at those two sidebars we're gonna create in this talk, I see that we have like a common part. The reason messages, it stays the same in both different sidebars, and we have a dynamic part. On the one sidebar we have the graph, on the other sidebar we have the magic happiness indicator featuring you. So usually when you want to override a part of your software, you use object orientation. Here's an example. I have a message class, I have a toString method, and then I call self.upper to make the message uppercase, and then I fill in that message in a string, so that is my toString method. So what if I don't like the self.upper thing? I don't want to have upper, I want to have the string in lowercase. I override it, and to override it, I extract it into a separate method, and I call the separate method in my original method. And then, if I want to configure that format method, I derive a new class, and I override the format method with my customized code. That is something you guys do every day, I guess. Okay? And we can do the same in views. Have you guys ever used view inheritance in Rails? No, because it sucks. Yes? My goodness. You have to tell me about, no, show me the code. So the thing in Rails, so first of all, they stole view inheritance from my cells gem. And it still sucks the way they do it. I'll tell you why. Let's check the time. Still a lot of time, I love it. Last time I had to give this talk in 30 minutes, it was a mission. So here's how view inheritance works in Rails. I have a controller, mummy controller. I call render partial item. So what's going to happen? The mummy controller will look at views, mummy, and then look for the item partial. What is that cracking sound? You're irritating me. Switch off your mobile phones. I have another. So if I want to use view inheritance, I derive a controller, child controller from mummy, and I still call render partial item. So what's going to happen here? The child controller is looking in views child for the items partial. If it can find the item partial there, it's going to look in the mummy directory and it's going to use this partial. So this is view inheritance. Let's see how we can use that for the sidebar. So here's the sidebar cell, just to remember what we just wrote. And if you look at the partial, we have that ugly if-else part that is figuring out, okay, if I'm in that controller, I draw the pie chart. If I'm in that controller, I draw the happiness chart. And I'm going to use view inheritance to override this. So I want to override something. If I want to override something, I have to extract it. In a view, this works just like as in a class with methods. So to override this part, I just introduce a new view. So in cells, we call partials and views. We just say views. So there is no distinguishing between partial and view. So I call render view, and then there should be a column. I'm sorry, it should be a symbol or a string. I should check my slides before I give talks. And so I extract the partial I want to override, or the part of the partial I want to override into a separate view, just like with the method. And now in my sidebar cell, I introduce a new view, of course, which is called lower box. And in that view, I just render the pie chart. Okay, so if I render If I render that cell, there's going to be recent messages and the pie chart. Now I derive a new cell class from my sidebar cell. It's called funny sidebar cell because there's a funny picture in it. And all I do is I have an empty class, and then I drop a new partial, a new view into app cells funny sidebar lower box. So it has the same name, but it's in a different directory. And I just draw the happiness chart. So obviously the sidebar cell is going to render the recent messages and the pie chart, and the funny sidebar cell is going to render the recent messages and the happiness indicator. So if I call render cell sidebar show, we get the beautiful old sidebar. And if I call render cell funny sidebar, I get the same with the happiness cell, the happiness box in the bottom. And this is all I need to override a specific part of the view. Is this guy sleeping? No. I'm sorry, I can boost it up a little bit if you're bored and dance and stuff. We're gonna dance tonight. Oh yes, we are. So I want you to be. This was a weak example for view inheritance. Usually you need view inheritance if you want to override specific small parts in your application, and you don't want to have deciders like figuring out, okay, if the partial is used in this context, then you render this partial, and if the partial is in this context, then that partial. So view inheritance helps you to clean up your view, just like you clean up classes. And all I did was I derived a new cell, and then I override the view. And that is all I need to change my sidebar entirely. And I can see you guys already thinking about where can I use this in my application. And the answer is nowhere. So one feature I like in cells is caching. So caching is also something I would say call Wild West in Rails right now, especially view caching. So if I want to cache this sidebar because the happiness indicator is taking too much CPU power, then I usually use a cache block. People are yawning. They are not yawning because my talk is boring. They are yawning because it's 3 o'clock, and that is the time when developers get sleepy, and every other guy on this world as well. So I use a cache helper call to cache this specific fragment. It's called fragment caching. I personally, I wrote a blog article about this. It's called caching the views, not the views job, or something like that, because caching is a crucial, dangerous part in your application. And you shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff in the view because you don't have any control in Rails over your view. So what we do in cells is instead of calling cache in the view, we call it in the class. And in the class, I just say, hey, cache my show action, so cache the view of the show action. And we can use the incoming chat parameter just to compute a cache key. So it's just like the cache call in a normal Rails view. We can do the same in an object-oriented manner in the cell class. So you can unit test this kind of stuff. You can inherit, and so on. You cannot inherit caching from the Rails view layer. Like if you have a cache helper, you're lost. So this is our approach to get caching back into object-oriented fashion. The cells gem is found on GitHub. I don't put URLs into my talks because people start to browse the internet instead of listening to my sweet voice. But you're gonna check it out on GitHub. If I don't get 30 new watchers or stars or whatever it's called now, I'll be embarrassed. The main principle of cells, so the idea I wrote it was to bring back MVC into Rails, because Rails is not MVC right now. Rails is like a big controller, collecting data, pushing the data into the view, and the view is more like pardon my French, it's more like a PHP script. It's just a big thing. I'm sorry for that, but clapping, people are clapping. So I don't blame Rails for this, but it is not MVC. MVC is something where you cut down your view, or yes, your user interface into small MVC stacks, like cells are. Cells are true MVC components. And this is how you should model your user interfaces, and not having one monolithic controller that takes care of all the partials about all the sidebars. You should have small, cut, independent, decoupled pieces that take care of specific parts of the page and that don't know anything else about each other. That is MVC. One interesting gem I found is Objectify. I'm not telling you guys to use it everywhere, but I'm gonna show you how it works. So basically, Objectify breaks down the workflow of a controller. Alex, are you all right? You look sleepy.
Just 3 o'clock.
Okay, 3 o'clock, down. So Objectify breaks down the workflow of a controller in Rails into 4 different classes. It's very interesting. Let me tell you how. So first of all, it hooks into the routing. And for example, I can say, if I get a post request on messages, don't use the Rails controller XYZ, use Objectify. So that is the first step. Then the second step is we hook in a policy class. So if that request is hit, then the policy class is called. And this policy class is only here for checking, is this request all right, or should I block that? In a separate class. And then, if the policy says, all right, let's go ahead, a service class is called, and the service class actually executes the code your controller is supposed to do. So the service class would contain the code you usually put into a controller action, like getting the chat object and calling whatever. And after that service is run, third class is called, which is called a responder. And the responder is only responsible for rendering the stuff that the service class aggregated. So this is the same workflow as we have in a Rails controller, but in 4 or 3 different classes. And I find this very interesting, because in Rails we tend to put everything just into the controller, and then you have big methods and stuff, and you call render, and then in render you call partial and stuff like that. And Objectify breaks that into 3 different instances that have clearly defined interfaces, and you really have to think about what am I doing in this controller before you start writing a big mess. I don't say use this everywhere, because you don't need 4 or 3 classes for a hello world request, but if it gets too complicated and too complex, you might think about using Objectify. It's found at bitlove Objectify on GitHub. Who is not on GitHub? Just curious. No, you're lying. That's everyone is on GitHub.
What is GitHub?
GitHub is it's like Facebook. I'm not sure what's wrong with me, but I have to drink. I'm still waiting for my vodka shot, because there is a vodka bottle right behind this. Let me point with my laser pointer. Right behind this, there is a brown backpack with a vodka bottle, and I'd like to have a shot now. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about APIs in your Rails project. So we had a little bit about the domain and the persistence layer, and then about the view. And the last thing I want to talk about is APIs. How you create APIs in your in your controller in Rails project. So usually the API for my project would list messages of the chat, or give you a message detail, or you could send a message to a specific chat. And what is common to all APIs is that you have a document and a service rendering that document, and also a service parsing documents. So this is how APIs work. So you emit stuff so people can read from your services, and you read your API, and you also parse incoming documents to let people change the state of your application. That is like what we all do when we write APIs. And the center of attention in APIs is always the document that is shared between the client and the service. And Rails has a lot of different parts to implement APIs. Like we have SJSON, and then you get a big 5-level or 10-level deep configuration hash if you have nested models. Or we have the new active model serializer. It's It's nice, I like it, but it's lacking some features I'm going to show you in a minute. And also on the other side, so this was the rendering, but on the parsing side, we don't have anything. We just have the params parser middleware that gives us the params hash. And the params hash is like magically parsed. If you get a JSON document, it's a parsed JSON document. If you get an XML, it's an XML document parsed into params hash. So you get a big hash. And my problem is that both sides, like the rendering part and the parsing part, they have to know about the document structure and the semantics, but they don't know, because active model serializer is just another template engine, sorry again, and params is just a hash that is parsed out of a JSON document. So we share a lot of document knowledge over the entire framework. So I came up with, let's pretend it was somebody else. Roy came up with a great gem. It's called RAW, and the main principle is called representers. So in order to render a document like this, the special part about this, so I'm rendering one of the messages of our chat. So we have the message here, the content, and then the created at. I'm not sure if we need that. And I also want hypermedia in that model, in that document. Hypermedia is a cool feature. It's basically the thing about REST. So when Rails and David Heinemeier Hansson talks about REST, I usually run out of the door. Is this on video? No. Because REST APIs doesn't mean we just use JSON and send it between client and service. REST APIs usually mean that we include hypermedia links into our documents to guide the client to all the different services and to all the different application states. So I gave a lot of talks about that last year. If you're interested, I can give you a URL, whatever. So my requirement for this document is I want to include properties and I want to include hypermedia. In order to render that kind of thing, I use a representer. And the representer is just a module. So I include some arbitrary thing from the raw gem, and then I can define properties, so the content and the created at. And I can also use link to define hypermedia. So I use link self to define, okay, I want to have a link with the rel pointing to self. And then I can use Rails URL helpers to create URLs, which is pretty great. To use this representer, I don't include that into a class. I get my message object, and then I call extend, just on that particular object, and inject the message representer. And then the message representer module will give us 2 JSON. So basically what we get is a string of JSON, exactly the kind of string I wanted. But that is only half of the representer's strength, because I can also use it the other way to parse documents. So what I do here is I create a brand new message object, I extend it again with the message representer module, and then I can call from JSON. And the representer will parse the JSON, and if I call message.content, it's going to be OES from the document, from the incoming document. So you can use the representers both ways. This is a very, very important thing to know, because it's not only for rendering, it's also for parsing. And what happens internally is that the representer just enriches your model or your object or whatever. And if we parse in a document, it just parses the JSON according to your definition. And then it calls the setters, content equals and created at equals on the object. So nothing more, there's no magic like figuring out, okay, how do I set created at? It's just calling an accessor or a writer. And the same with 2JSON. So when I call 2JSON, the representer just goes through the list. Okay, I know, what do I know about this model? I know content and I know created at. And it just calls the readers of these properties to compile the document. And of course, we can have nested representers, like representers containing representers and stuff like that. So you can have really, oh no, it's vibrating. We can have nested documents just as we have them in SJSON or 2JSON. We can have collections and stuff like that. So if you want to have a list of messages, you would use the collection method. And we can also have different formats. So I'm not limited to JSON. If I include the XML module, I suddenly get to and from XML and I can render XML. And the same works with YAML and whatever. So we have a lot of document format engines in Representer, which is pretty handy. So if you decide, okay, I don't want to have JSON anymore, I want XML, you just throw in a new module, the XML module, and you're done. You can save a lot of work, you can go home earlier and drink. How's that? You use that stuff very easily in Rails with basically you use the represents method in a controller, and then you can configure the controller. You are representing messages in the format JSON, and suddenly respond with will automatically get the right representative for message and blah blah blah. It will render, and you can also use the representative in Rails when you parse incoming stuff. So again, we have the represents configuration, and then you just call consume, and consume will take care of creating a message object, parsing the JSON or the XML or whatever, and assigning all the values by calling from JSON. So it's pretty handy and really usable, really easy usable in Rails. Found on GitHub, which is the Facebook for nerds. And I tried to give you a little bit of an overview about how to split your domain from your persistence, how to model problems without thinking in active record, but in plain old GUI objects. We talked a little bit about view inheritance, how cells can help you to split up your monolithic view into small pieces. We saw how Objectify can help us to split controller workflows into classes, and RAW helps us to have object-oriented documents in Ruby. And so these were like recipes. Alex, where are you? So these were recipes, and what I want to say to the world, or you guys, is don't fear the class. I mean, don't be afraid of introducing new classes or instances in your architecture, because this is what makes an architecture. I mean, classes are what makes an architecture, and there is no need to be scared of over-engineering or getting Java like if you use classes at the right point. So if you have a fucking problem, use a fucking class. Thank you very much.